listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Zach Bechtold and Matt Franks. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast and check us out online at beardedtheologians.com. You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Matt Franks
and Zach Bechtold.
This week on the Bearded Theologians, one of the alternative readings for the Psalms is Psalm 23. And as Zach and I were talking about this in our pre-show, we talked about that this would be a great kind of reflection upon what's going on in our current society. And Psalm 23 definitely speaks to that. And so, Zach, as you read through Psalm 23 and as you think of what's going on currently in our world, what kind of stirs up within you?
Well, first of all, when I think of Psalm 23, I also think of Tupac, because Psalm 23 is made popular by Gangsta's Paradise, and I think that's an important note to take away. That if you want some extracurricular theological listening, Spotify that. Listen to it on YouTube. No, it's good because this is a very common favorite scripture. Psalm 23 is, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He lets me rest on green, grassy meadows. And when we look at the world around us having so much natural disaster, with several hurricanes, earthquakes, just here in North America, but also you look at the tragedies of Las Vegas and Charlottesville, and just the things in the last few months that happened that are just awful. We retreat into this passage of the Lord is my shepherd. And what does that mean? What comfort does that bring? He leads me into restful waters. Well, how do we do that in the midst of chaos and in the midst of tragedy? And to me, I think where we get that is when we grieve. When we openly, we actively grieve, and Psalm 23 gets there in verse 4. Even when I walk through the darkest valleys, I fear no danger. And to me, that's grief. That's openly acknowledging the grief in this world and saying, look, God, this sucks. This is not good. None of what's going on in our world right now is good. But how do we find rest in that? How do we find hope in the midst of what is going on? And so, Psalm 23 conjures is the wrong word. like a right. There's a pot in it. Psalm 23 really brings that out for me in this time of just grief and hurt. That there is truly hope as we walk through this darkness with each other and with God. And so I'll stop talking. And Matt, how do you feel? I guess what stirs inside of you when you read Psalm 23 and live in the world that we live in?
So as I was thinking about this and thinking about, we kind of brought it up in the pre-show, and you were kind of like, man, I preach that all the time at funerals, and I'm the same way. It to me, it's one of the one scriptures that gets read every funeral for me, and it's because I like the way the Common English translated it. I like the way that they handled it. Verse 4, even when I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no danger because you are with me. Your rod, your staff, they protect me. You set a table for me right in front of my enemies. You bathe my head in oil. My cup is so full it spills over. Your goodness and your faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the Lord's house as long as I live. Mm-hmm. And I think of that, and I think of all that's going on. Not only in our society, but just, what's been going on since the very beginning of human existence, that God has been there the entire time to be with us, to be the light, to be the comforter, to be the shepherd. And the writer of this psalm is being honest. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. And when we think about that as sheep, because that's what we are God's sheep. If we allow God to be our shepherd, we will lack nothing. And even in the midst of struggle and trial and difficulty, we have to be reminded that in those in those dark valleys, that we are not alone. And I think far too often we do that. We abandon all hope. We lose and say, man, I'm checking out, and I don't want to be any part of this. And that's like the worst attitude that we can have. And we need to embrace and fight evil and injustice in this world. I think of our baptismal vows in the United Methodist Church. Do you accept the power that God gives you to resist evil, to reject the powers of this world? And if we can do that, man, could you just imagine if we could do that, what kind of good we could do in this world? And if we don't make it about ourselves and we open ourselves up to the possibilities and to what could change we could bring in this world. But here's the deal. We get scared, or the road is difficult, or the road is dark and it's scary. And we forget that the Lord is our shepherd. We lack nothing.
Right. And God, I talked about this Sunday. We make excuses of why we can't, or why we shouldn't, or why we don't have to walk through this time with people. I live too far away. That doesn't affect me. I don't know anybody there. We're just going to be silent because of fear and things like that. And it's like, look, no, we have a stake in this, because there are people out there hurting and simply retreating, or I don't know the word you used. Man, I remember. I lost that thought. But we retreat out of it and we don't speak to it. Speak to the issue, speak to the injustices, and speak to the evil in the world, because they don't affect us. We're not directly connected to the event or the thing or whatever. And we can't do that. We have to speak up. We have to speak to these things, these evils in the world, because if we don't, who will? And we have the opportunity and I think call to speak hope to these things. And like I said, if we don't speak hope to them, who will speak, and what are they going to speak to?
Right. And I think the question becomes, and when we see this in the Psalm, who is your leader? Who is guiding you? Who is guiding you in the proper paths? And if we allow God to be our guide, and I know that that's like the crazy, stupid Sunday school answer, but how much of the answer is that the answer? And we've allowed ourselves to be held captive by our devices. Right. That we have forgotten that the real answer is allowing God to be in control, and to realize that God is God and we are not, but we are needed to do God's work here on this world. And if we can open ourselves up, that even though when we walk in those darkest valleys, that we will have nothing to fear. Can we imagine what this world would be like if we could say, no more violence, no more separation, no more dividedness that this world has just allowed in? Because we've been in my church, we've been walking through Moses, Adam Hamilton's book, Moses and the footsteps of a reluctant prophet. And one of the things that has come up with me as I've read through this is that the Israelites, man, they sound like the church. And you have Moses who's trying to lead the church to be better, to make it to that promised land, to be the church that God has called it to be. And Moses does everything in his self to get them there. And I mean, he obviously falls short because of his own devices, but one of the things that Moses had in mind, that no matter what was going on, no matter what the complaints were, no matter what the situation was, that Moses knew that God was with them, leading them and guiding them and pushing them to that promised land. And we have to be, as people, as faithful as Moses in that situation.
Well, and I think what brings that out, it just in this verse or in this passage, your goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life. That's there, that pursuit, that you're with me. That's that hope in that darkness, in that reluctancy, and that retreat of, I just don't want to deal with it. Your goodness and faithful love will pursue me all of the days of my life. The good, the bad, the right, and the wrong, it's there. And as good Methodist, whether we acknowledge it or believe it or want it or not, that is there. And I think that's something so fruitful and so hopeful to remember as we navigate the world that we live in, especially these days where it's hard to find hope in that darkness sometimes.
And that's why we need God's prevenient grace there. and to recognize it when we've experienced it, and to make that jump from just living in that life to agree to live to holy living, and live in a sanctified life. And it's not, see, I have a problem with the sanctified language, because when I hear sanctified, I hear I'm holier than thou.
Right.
And
It's
when I hear
that perfection piece,
it's that perfection piece that I get, that like flusters me a little bit.
right?
But yet I'm reminded it's holding me accountable to be the person that God has called me to be, but to make it where the Lord is my shepherd. And I think that that's, we could go on about this for hours, and I'm sure we'll eventually come back to this again in a future podcast. But I think that when we boil it down and we read through the psalm, and when we hear it at funerals, we're reminded of that eternal hope that no matter what, God is with us.
Right.
And I think that that's just like one of the most powerful things, that when we can hold on to that and live into that, man, we become an unstoppable force.
And I think that's our question for today. How in the darkness of life, wherever that is, whatever that is for you, how are you living into that and bringing hope to the world around you? What are the things you're doing? Because you're right. We can't have, you can't have the prevenient grace without the call to action of the sanctifying grace. There's that process, there's that step. So, our question today is, what action are you taking to bring hope to the world? Share that with us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on the website, wherever you find this, wherever you listen to us or consume this information. Share with us, how are you being conversation with us through those mediums. We love having the conversation. We love hearing from you. You can check out more at beardedtheologians.com. We've had some great conversations going on there. We just finished up a podcast series on the Book of James. We have some great blogs coming out from some great contributors. You can find all of our past ones there. You can buy t-shirts and mugs. Christmas is coming up. All of the proceeds go to help us continue to do this podcast and do it for free. So we appreciate all of your generous gifts, your support, whether it's listening, whether it's buying a mug. But we appreciate you and all that you do to help us continue to do this and bring a little bit of hope in the light of darkness through this podcast. For the Bearded Theologians, I'm Zach Bechtold.
I'm Matt Franks.
Thanks for checking us out. Oh, there it is.
Thank you for listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast. We hope you've enjoyed listening, and we hope that you share our content online through Facebook and social media, and we hope that you check out our Beardcast store at beardedtheologians.com and pick up some great Bearded Theologians gear. We hope you have a good day.
I was hoping you'd pull it up for the outro.